This week on The Futurists.
In my last two books, Stars and Bones, and the one that's coming out next year called Descendant Machine, they're set in a universe where humanity, and I didn't mean this to be topical when I started writing it, but they're set in a world where humanity, the planet's in trouble, the climate's in trouble, and then through a series of escalating international tensions, a nuclear war is launched. The day the book was published, the tanks rolled into Ukraine, so I thought, oh my God. At that moment, an alien entity intervenes and saves the human race, but exiles them from the planet in order to give the planet time to heal itself. And we're set adrift in some arcs, which are intelligent and can look after every need. Nobody is starving. Nobody is in want for shelter or medical attention. It's what you might call a utopia in that there's no scarcity, there's no inequality, everyone has everything they need. Various historical periods have been considered utopias by the people living in them, but for the people who were catering for them and slaving for them, it was certainly not a utopia. So utopia is just, I think, depends where you stand.
Well, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King, with my co-host, Rob Tercek, and we've got a real treat for you today. We're going to get totally sci-fi. So joining us on the show today is a British author of science fiction. He has written several novels. He's won the BSFA Award for Best Novel twice for Ak Macau and Embers of War, which is probably my favorite, dealing with a sentient starship that has regrets of his role or its role in the war that it was in, and also he's done a host of short stories, magazines. He writes in the engineering space. He's given lectures on creative writing at many universities. Gareth Powell, welcome to The Futurists.
Hi.
Hi, Gareth.
So, you write these big, epic sci-fi pieces. Space operas is generally the genre that we identify with. But I maybe we can just start with what got you into this field. What interests you about sci-fi, in general, and what took you down this path?
I think I've always been down this path. I don't think there was a time I wasn't at least halfway down it. Some of my very earliest memories, I'm going back to the age of 3 or 4, are of watching Star Trek, the original series, on an old black and white TV. I think this was the very early 70s, so it's probably the first time it was shown in the UK. And at the same time, we were watching footage from the last moon landings, from the Apollo-Soyuz link-up is one I very vividly remember. And Skylab, and then the space shuttle, Star Wars came along, Battlestar Galactica. The early 70s, early 80s were just, it seemed obvious that by the year 2000, if we weren't all dead from a nuclear war, we would all be living on the moon. So, I was always in that headspace. I read Larry Niven, Robert Heinlein, a lot of Arthur C. Clarke growing up. And it was what I always wanted to do.
I can relate to all this.
Yeah, I just had no way to understand how you got from being a kid growing up in a village near Bristol to being Arthur C. Clarke. So, and it wasn't till I was a bit older. I always tried to write, but it wasn't until the turn of the millennium when obviously we were going into a whole new millennium, and I was due to turn 30, and I thought, right, it's time to put up or shut up. So I wrote my first novel. So.
How did it feel starting to write for the first time?
Well, I've made many first attempts over the years, so this was just another one. The difference was that I actually stuck with it. And got through to a conclusion. So,
how did you do that? Because quite a few people start to write something, even people who start a blog and then they abandon it. How did you manage to find the stamina to persist?
You could call it stamina. You could call it sheer bloody mindedness. but I was working sort of 40 hours a week for a software company at the time. So I would come home, and then in the evenings I would write from about 9 o'clock through to midnight every night. And that's obviously before I had children. So that whole routine took a nosedive after that. But that was basically what I did every night. I would come home, I would write for 3 hours before bed.
So no Star Trek, no TV at that point, just writing.
I find it interesting. You write at home mostly?
Yes.
Because I mostly write at coffee shops. I like the white noise. It helps me creatively. But then, we had Kevin J. Anderson on as one of our early episodes, and he records into a dictaphone while he's hiking. That's how he writes, which I just find that extraordinary. I still can't work out how he's able to do so well with that, but because dealing with all the different plot lines and things like that in your head. But I guess he churns out these books, like, what does he do, 6 or 7 books a year at least, I think, so which is just just phenomenal throughput. I know you did Light Chaser with Peter F. Hamilton. I do, I find some synergy there from both of you guys, because you do tend to write, and Ian Banks is another one with the Culture series. When you're talking about far-flung human, evolution and the species of humanity in the future, living with intelligent warships and all of this sort of stuff. But in terms of envisioning these worlds and the worldviews that you've created, do you do a lot of planning in the background and sort of mapping out what these civilizations are going to be like? Or is it more that this sort of develops in the narrative, and you take that core plot, like in Embers of War, with this, sentient, warship, and build on that? Or you're trying to create a longer term view of humanity from a space opera perspective?
I do a lot less planning than people seem to assume I do. I usually start any story with the characters, and then concoct a background against which I can tell the story I want to tell about those characters. I will usually have a fairly good kind of notion of what the background universe is like. But I'm not one of those. I'm not J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm not going to invent new languages and maps and all of that. I just I flesh out what is needed in order to tell the story. So there's no extraneous, hopefully no extraneous explaining and scene setting. Hopefully everything that I put in there just increases the verisimilitude of the story. And a lot of the time it will also evolve organically as the story goes along. For Embers of War, for instance, I wanted to tell a story about a warship who had accidentally developed a conscience. So in order to do that, I had to have a war. And in order to do that, I had to have 2 sides to the war. So I went and thought of these 2 sides to the war. And it kind of grew out of that. It wasn't, I didn't come up with the universe first and then think, how can I explore this? I came up with the character and thought, how can this character best exist? And what will present the biggest challenges to her? In terms of kind of communicating that, I kind of just like to sprinkle details in and names that maybe aren't explained. And I guess I got that from the first Star Wars movie, when we all watched it in 1975 or whenever, and Ben Kenobi said, "Your father fought with me in the Clone Wars." And we were all thinking, what the hell are the Clone Wars?
Exactly.
But it just kind of fired your imagination, and it made the universe seem so much larger. And so I just tried to do that, just little details that kind of spark the imagination and make the universe seem more real.
When you start thinking about these far-flung, things, obviously part of the fuel for this is thinking about the future tech that we might deploy, how this evolves. What do you do in terms of research to keep you grounded in areas like artificial intelligence, gene therapy, sort of the stuff that we're seeing develop now that could evolve into this worldview?
I keep up with the sort of popular science news through New Scientist and Scientific American and Twitter feeds, and just keep a general sense of the temperature of the room, so to speak. And on top of that, if I'm specifically researching, for instance, artificial intelligence, I'll just try and read up a bit about the field, some of the philosophy around the field, and enough to make it seem plausible. Obviously, I don't know how to construct an artificial intelligence. Otherwise, I would not be a poor science fiction writer. I'd be a multi-billionaire living in the Bahamas. So I just kind of try to get it so it looks and feels authentic. My blueprint is, for instance, if I was writing a book set today, I wouldn't have a character walk out of his house, get into a car and spend 5 pages explaining how the internal combustion engine works. He would just get in his car and drive off. So I try to do that with the technology in my science fiction. So I don't try and I don't have characters turning to each other and saying, as you know, the quantum drive works like this. Because it's,
technobabble, as it's called in Star Trek, right? Yeah.
So I just try to show it working and let the reader kind of imagine how that is working and kind of get an idea of the constraints of the technology and the limits of the technology, which is the important thing for the story.
That makes sense. You're doing a service for your readers because they don't have to plow through all of that logical exposition. But you're also saving yourself some effort because really it's a story. People want to be entertained. They don't want a technical manual to read through. I noticed, I think on your blog, you wrote something about interstellar transportation and the notion that, if you're going to have spaceships, then you're going to have to explain how they get from point A to point B. And there's a series of logical fallacies that can happen if you don't think that through carefully. So, while you're telling us that you're first and foremost writing about characters and drama and conflict and situations, I see that you also have at least part of your process is to then kind of apply a logical constraint to some of the assumptions in the world. And then from that, extrapolate out what the mechanisms are to make that world work, even if you don't have to flesh out exactly how the mechanisms work or how the physics behind it work. Did I get that right? Is that kind of on track?
Yeah, for any technology you invent, you have to look at the potential downsides. It's the old saying, you can't predict the car without predicting the traffic jam. So,
well, don't you wish we did that with social media about 10 years ago? Yeah. Had we spent a minute to think about the potential downsides, maybe we wouldn't be in the situations that we're in right now.
Yes, it's the old Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park.
Yes,
right. Like, maybe you shouldn't have done it. And it's so with, for instance, if you have an interstellar empire with ships that can travel cheaply and instantaneously between planets, interstellar trade makes sense. If you have a situation more like kind of 17th century Earth, where voyages are dangerous and take a very long time, that trade makes less sense. So you would have, for instance, set up a colony in America. That colony has to become self-sustaining, rather than you wouldn't be importing the food from England every month. So you have to look at that situation and apply that to interstellar thing. There has to be a very good reason why you would take anything across light years, because of the cost and the difficulty. So there has to be a very good reason why that colony can't simply make it itself. So it's things like that that set up the society, and the more you think about things like that, the more it kind of shapes the society and shapes the characters. And also, if you introduce limits to your technology, so for instance, if the starships can only travel at 1 light year an hour, or if if they appear to travel instantaneously, but from the external observer, it takes the same amount of time as light would take to go from point A to point B. Something like that, then you have to think of the implications of that, and the implications of that can create a great story.
Yes, in a way, it's a bit like the analogy I was thinking of before this call is a tennis court. You have a tennis court with with lines on the court. Those are the boundaries. Without that, you're just batting a ball around in a field, and it's not as much fun, really. It's not as challenging. What makes it interesting and what makes it fair is to define those constraints. And then within those constraints, that's where the drama occurs. That's basically your stage, right? So your stage is a set of technological or physical constraints on what that world's possible, what's possible in that world, I should say. And then within that, you can start to tell a story. I think your inspiration, you mentioned in your writing that you're inspired by Ian Banks, who encourages you to dream big and don't be encumbered by too much logical constraint, but rather think big. One of the things you mentioned is that most sci-fi writers tend to write about dystopias. And what you like about Ian Banks is that he can envision a utopia and find the drama in that.
Yeah, I like that too.
I think that's a really interesting notion because we've heard plenty about dystopian futures on this show, and Brett knows I tend to go there anyway without the science fiction writers helping me. It's easy to envision dystopian worlds. It's easy to extrapolate from the problems that we face today in today's society, and then think, gee, what's the worst case scenario? Some of us tend to do that naturally, but you go the other way. You actually envision utopias. Tell me about that part of your practice.
I'm with you, Gareth, by the way.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call the societies I envision utopian. Obviously, in the embers of war, they've just had this cataclysmic war between two different human factions with very different political beliefs. I guess you could call it utopian in the fact we survive the 21st and 22nd centuries as a species, which some people would find doubtful at the moment with the challenges we face.
Yeah.
In my last two books, Stars and Bones, and the one that's coming out next year called Descendant Machine, they're set in a universe where humanity, and I didn't mean this to be topical when I started writing it, but they're set in a world where humanity, the planet's in trouble, the climate's in trouble, and then through a series of escalating international tensions, a nuclear war is launched. And the day the book was published, the tanks rolled into Ukraine. So I thought, oh my God. But at that moment, an alien entity intervenes and saves the human race, but exiles them from the planet in order to give the planet time to heal itself. And we're set adrift in some arcs which are intelligent and can look after every need. Nobody is starving. Nobody is in want for shelter or medical attention. It's what you might call a utopia in that there's no scarcity, there's no inequality, everyone has everything they need. However, one or more of the characters argue that maybe this has infantilized us as a society, in the fact now we have nothing to strive for, and it's a world where there's nothing to strive for is maybe not a world that humans can exist in. So there are still people going out there exploring. There are still people getting into trouble. There's still crime, even though there's no money. There's still people. There's still murder. There's still crimes of passion. So there's still a police force. There are still laws. So any utopia is only utopia from a certain point of view, and one could argue that. Various historical periods have been considered utopias by the people living in them, but for the people who were catering for them and slaving for them, it was certainly not a utopia. So utopia is just, I think, depends where you stand.
How do you obviously incorporate artificial intelligence and sentient machines and so forth into a lot of your writing. How do you feel AI is going to affect the human species, politically, socially, economically? Have you got some thoughts on that? I know it's a bit of a broader question, but
it depends. It could go many ways, and there's been many books written around about the turn of the millennium. There were a lot of books written about the singularity, where we would get runaway intelligence that would outstrip us and take over the world and so forth. I think it's inevitable that we will eventually create a machine that thinks, or at least appears to think as well as we do. I think it will be philosophically incredibly difficult to say categorically whether that machine is self-aware or not. I think that's going to be a very, very hard thing to actually define. I think there will be a lot of claims to artificial intelligence before we get real artificial intelligence. And I think through those claims we will get... I don't think there will be a huge trumpeting in society like, we have created AI. Like in The Matrix, Morpheus said, humanity is united as they create. That's not going to happen. So we're going to get it in a lab and it's going to leak out in the papers and people, yeah, okay, we've got AI, whatever. And it won't be till it causes a problem or presents us with some drastically brilliant solutions that we will actually start to appreciate it, in a widespread kind of way. It'll be a niche interest. Longer term, assuming it's amiable to coexistence with humans, I can see creating extremely intelligent AI could help a great deal with planning, with dealing with very complex systems such as the climate, the economy, every complex system from like traffic flow. It would be extremely beneficial. Whether or not they would be amiable to that kind of coexistence depends, I think, how we treat them to start with. So if we treat them as a slave race, basically, then obviously that's how you get Terminators. So it's going to be a very interesting time, and I think it could, like any tool, it could be of extreme benefit or extreme hazard.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Saying that, as you're mentioning that about AI, the way it can be very beneficial for some complex challenges that we currently can't get our hands wrapped around. It occurs to me that this is one of the reasons why people often focus on dystopia, why it's easier to focus on a dystopia. It's because as soon as we solve a complex problem, we tend to take that solution for granted. One example of that is vaccines, right? So, without a doubt, this is the greatest medical advance of the 20th century, is the ability to immunize people against communicable disease. And then just, 2 generations after we've achieved that, after we've stopped smallpox, the scourge of civilization for centuries, we take it for granted so much so that people start to attack vaccines and they start to cast doubt on them. I noticed something in your book, Stars and Bones, that is this idea of this entity that can infect anything, and so that you can't tell who's real or who's been infected and who's fake, I suppose, or you start to create this element of doubt, persistent doubt, right, in an otherwise very, very pleasant world. And it seemed to me, I don't know if this is accurate, but it seemed to me that's a reflection a little bit on our pandemic situation. During COVID-19, there wasn't just one pandemic, the infectious disease COVID-19. There was a second pandemic, which was distributed through social media, which was misinformation, right? So you saw this kind of horrifying experience, at least for me, where you'd see people that you thought you knew well, people who you were connected to on social media, and they'd start to spread utter nonsense, disinformation, stuff that was easily disproven, where 5 minutes of searching on Google would quickly show you that notion was not at all accurate. But people would stand behind it and they'd sort of double down on it. If you called them out on it and said, hey, that's actually not true, they'd get quite surly about it. And I found that experience to be really unnerving during the pandemic. It's like, well, one thing, we all face this problem, this infectious disease, but now among us, there are people who are actually, quibbling and arguing and resisting and spreading false information about things that might solve the problem. What was that at all at work when you were writing Star and Bones? Were you thinking about that notion of doubt when you created that entity?
When I first sort of planned that before the pandemic. And I was thinking more of sort of John Carpenter's movie The Thing. I'm thinking of, I think there's a line where they say, if this escapes into the wider population, it's game over. So I thought, well, let's take something similar and set it loose in a wider population.
Nice.
And havoc ensues. But as I said, when I started writing that, and I was there writing about these quarantine measures and this disease, and then lockdown happened, and I was in the middle of writing that, and it was just like, my brain was like, oh my God. What am I doing? Nobody will ever want to read this because it's too topical. So yeah, and that was a challenge, and I've actually found the writing of that book very hard because of that, because of the stress of the pandemic and the fact that I was talking about related subjects. It became very, very difficult. I think I say in the afterward that book nearly broke me. It got to the point where I didn't think I would ever finish it, and if I didn't finish it, I would never write another book. Wow. That was the big challenge I sort of had to fight through with the pandemic, and eventually came out the other side.
Do you think of yourself as a philosopher in that respect, Gareth? Because a lot of what you're talking about is human philosophy, right?
I have studied philosophy and psychology a bit. I wouldn't claim to be any kind of authority at all, but I do think about these things. And, I've got a shelf full of Greek and Roman philosophers' books.
Awesome. Well, let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, let's maybe talk about your new book, Descendant Machine, and talk a little bit more about where you see humanity going. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King. We'll take a quick break and be right back with more from Gareth Powell.
Welcome to Breaking Banks, the #1 global fintech radio show and podcast. I'm Brett King.
And I'm Jason Henricks. Every week since 2013, we explore the personalities, startups, innovators, and industry players driving disruption in financial services.
From incumbents to unicorns, and from cutting-edge technology to the people using it to help create a more innovative, inclusive, and healthy financial future. I'm JP Nichols, and this is Breaking Banks.
Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek with my co-host, Brett King. And today we're talking to Gareth Powell, who's a multiple award-winning science fiction author, who's also written a really useful manual for aspiring writers. Gareth, it's been fun talking to you because this conversation has bounced around between 3 points. One of them is writing drama, writing stories that are compelling. Another point is this notion that you've got to put some boundaries around that. Otherwise, you're just out in the field bouncing a ball, and that's not much fun. And so there's some notion of imposing some logical constraints on that possible world. But where we just got to before the break was some of the philosophical underpinnings, some of the bigger thoughts about how does that affect us as humanity? How does that affect our relationships with each other? So on that note, I thought we'd start with that a little bit. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your most recent book.
Yeah, Descendant Machine is a book set in the same universe as the previous novel, Stars and Bones, but set 50 years later, and I don't think any of the same characters. So it's a standalone novel and can be read independently, but it's just set in the same universe. And this one is much more about the nature of time and the nature of religion and the nature of who we are and the purpose of what different races have in the universe, and who sets that purpose, and who decides. And is tradition toxic? It's because we're not deciding for ourselves what we should be doing. We're following the dictates of people who've been dead for a long time. It's just peer pressure from dead people, and it's kind of exploring those kind of notions, while at the same time exploring, this sounds awful, but interspecies love. Does love transcend physicality? Is it more of a mental, spiritual thing than a physical thing, and so on? So there's a lot of different things going on in there around a kind of quest-style narrative. So
I gather that a couple of the main characters in the new book, The Senate Machine, tend to be sort of a high priest type figure or something like that. Like this, just from reading the description, like this order of monks who've been, there to protect this machine from re-waking up. Because the issue is, of course, what's the machine going to do when it's turned on? You mentioned this sort of yin and yang, of religion from a traditional perspective. Lots of writers like Ian Banks, even Alistair Reynolds, they don't tend to tackle, they if they do mention religion, it tends to be with these primitive societies that are out of the loop in terms of technological advancement, but as a human species, how do you think we'll develop in respect to that relationship with religion? Just an easy question.
I think religion is something apart from technology in a lot of ways. I think religion is, I think it's fairly fundamental part of our human makeup. And I'm not necessarily talking about organized religion here. I'm talking about, even I know perfectly rational, scientifically minded people who will tug a forelock when they see a magpie, or or who will sleep with the lights on after watching a horror film, even though they know that those monsters don't exist. At 3 a.m, maybe they kind of do. So and we have people who I think recently, instead of saying, well, God will provide, God will do this, people say, oh, the universe will provide. Instead of saying prayers to God, you manifest your
manifesting. Yes, Jim Carrey talks about that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, and it's very much prayer with the serial numbers filed off and a new terminology.
I like that.
So I think we will always have part of us that is a little bit spiritual, a little bit kind of superstitious, and a part of us, we're pattern recognizing machines. So when things happen that we can't explain, we put together patterns of coincidence and patterns of, different events and stuff, and ascribe them a cause. And I don't see that changing, because I think that is a fundamental part of humanity, and it goes hand in hand with our storytelling. Imaginations, that we invent stories to explain things.
We do. We create mythology. We do it all the time. And even when we think we're being scientific and rigorous about it, we're still inventing mythology. There's a strong argument to be made that there's a cult of the singularity, this belief that ever increasing progress and ever improving machine intelligence is someday going to convert to something magical and it'll change the world. And there's quite a number of people that believe that so fervently. But even though that's just a projection, right? That's a theory. It's not reality. I was just talking to a gentleman the other day about Homo economist, and he was giving me this kind of mini lecture about rational thinking, how people make rational, logical decisions, economic decisions, and so on. And I stopped and I said, hang on, you do understand that there is no such thing as Homo economicus. There is no rational human. We are all irrational on some level, and we have a tendency to fantasize and invent these scenarios that aren't grounded in any kind of reasoning, and they're not grounded in scientific logic either. And people make all sorts of irrational economic decisions. And we see that in the way people vote as well. We can point to examples in the UK where you are, and here in the United States quite recently, where people vote against their own economic self-interest. Part of that is what makes storytelling so interesting, right? That's sort of why we're driven to consume things like science fiction, because we wonder, what will life be like in these alternate worlds or these future worlds? And will humans ever escape the affliction of being haunted or doomed by these irrational thoughts? And maybe that's where this impulse, this religiosity impulse, springs from. Some people say that there's a transcendent impulse, right? This is more along the lines of Freud and Jung, where people have a craving or desire to be a part of something that will outlast them, that we're fearful of mortality. And so there's a desire, then there's some mechanism within us to strive to be a part of something bigger that will outlast us. And that's why we want to be a part of a religious tradition, because we believe that will continue, that will endure.
I think
does that kind of thinking? Yeah, go ahead.
I would think that was more true in the Victorian era, when the Victorians were obsessed with death, because obviously Victoria was in mourning for 40 years, and they were obsessed with death and legacy. And our cities are covered in statues of Victorian men who wanted to leave a legacy. And, they built theatres, they built art galleries to put their name on there so it would last. And that was their kind of, and you don't see that quite so much now. There are fewer people are putting up statues to themselves, and there doesn't seem to be that obsession with death and with leaving something behind, that they're, almost a kind of, I think that's why the Victorians were so obsessed with the Egyptians as well, because they were leaving legacies and grave goods and so on. I'm sure I'm sure there were some Victorian noblemen who, if they could have got away with it, would have built a pyramid, and mummified themselves for all time. And that partly drove Victorian society to become more egalitarian, and to build these libraries and theatres and things for everybody, and hospitals, and also technologically, that it drove the engineers like Brunel and Stevenson to build and to create and to strive to build these edifices and these engines and things. So yeah, in a sense, there, sort of an obsession with death was really a strong driver of Victorian society. Now, I think we have much longer lifespans. We have much less kind of infant mortality. We have fewer diseases. I suffered from whooping cough about 6 years ago, and it was nasty. It was really nasty, but I got antibiotics and I got over it.
Right. And you're confident that you'll get over it. You're not doubtful about that. You're very confident you'll get over it, right? We don't go to the hospital now fearful that we're going to die inside of it.
Yeah. And in Victorian times, you got whooping cough, you were fairly
condemned
to die. You got a wound, you were.
Okay, but let me play with that notion for a second. Let me play with that notion, because today, certainly, the most famous and perhaps the most successful entrepreneur and CEO in the world right now is Elon Musk. He's got legions of followers, millions of people who are fans of his, and he's very explicit about his motivations. He doesn't hide this stuff. His motivation is, there is a mathematical certainty at some point the planet Earth is going to be hit by an asteroid, and it would be foolish on a cosmic scale for us not to diversify and hedge our bets and colonize or, move to another planet. And so that's everything that he does. Every waking moment of his time is devoted to getting humans to Mars. Whether or not he's successful, whether or not that's a pipe dream, leave that aside. I know he's super controversial, but isn't that kind of a modern continuation of that Victorian impulse you were just telling us a bit about? Isn't he kind of the, Isambard Brunel of the 21st century?
It's interesting way of looking at it. Is he a philanthropist, or is he acting out of self-interest? It's, that's a debate maybe somebody else is more qualified to have. I mean, I don't know the man particularly, but we can all agree that having your eggs in more than one basket makes a lot of sense. The actual methodology of that, for instance, once, say, for the sake of argument, Elon Musk takes 1,000 people to Mars. And they set up a society there. Will Elon Musk be in charge? Will Elon Musk's son be the next person in charge? When his money,
Lord Emperor Musk, yes,
exactly. But when he gets there, his money isn't worth anything. There is no economy there. There is no. Everybody is subsisting in the same, breathing the same air. How does he remain in control? Does he have a finger on the turn the air off button? And suddenly we have a dictatorship. So how does he keep control? How does he keep order? How does he police crimes? Suddenly we're getting into these sociological issues that can turn very, very nasty very, very quickly.
Sounds like a pretty good science fiction story. It sounds like a good preface for a book, actually. Yeah. What would that world be like? He certainly would be, he's not he could very well be a benevolent dictator, and maybe not so benevolent.
Yeah, you see this a lot with the billionaires who are planning on building bunkers in New Zealand or whatever, and then they're thinking, well, how do I keep my security forces in check after the apocalypse when I can't pay them because what's money going to be worth? So, and they're talking about, do we put exploding collars on them? Do we hold the key to the food cabinet? And that's, there's going to be a revolution and you're going to be shot and somebody's going to take your bunker because you can't, you can't default to slavery as your survival, in order for your personal survival. So there have to be wider and more kind of communal solutions.
It is astonishingly characteristic of the time that we happen to be living in, that we have some of the richest people in the history of the planet. And what those people are focused on is not like Andrew Carnegie's mission to educate the public and build public schools and so forth. They're not interested in equal access to voting or equal access to education or economic opportunity. What they're really interested in is building a bomb-proof bunker, someplace nice, someplace pristine.
Robot sentries.
Loading up their snowmobiles with gold bars so they can get across the border to Canada in the winter or something. It's really quite shocking. It's like they want to take it all with them. Talk about the impulse. This is your transcendent impulse, right? These people are like, I made all this money. I've got to take it with me into the next dimension.
Like the pharaohs.
Yeah, it's interesting. So looking at some sort of bigger picture stuff, you've mentioned Ian Banks, Arthur C. Clarke, Heinlein. Talk about how your worldview was changed by sci-fi, as you were growing up.
I think sci-fi, it makes you think about things in a completely different way than you're used to. And when I was growing up, I remember reading The Ring-World Engineers by Larry Niven.
Right.
I must have been about 9 or 10 years old. And I remember very specifically walking down a road thinking, well, why does that work like that? Why does that work like that? Why do we do things like that? Because the way the book's written, the main character is figuring out the world around him and piecing it together. And having got immersed in the book, I found myself doing the same thing. And it changes the way you think. And so I was picking up sci-fi book covers, and instead of going, oh, that's a pretty monster, I was going, how would that monster work? What would it eat? How does it maintain buoyancy in the clouds like that? And it just starts you thinking and asking questions, and those questions turn into stories. But also it makes you look at the world and think, well, just because we've always done something like that, is that really the best way to do it?
Yeah.
Now, Gareth, that is very much like what we do when we do forecasting, for corporations and organizations that want to plan for the future. Many companies, many organizations, they want to have a 5-year or 10-year plan, and they'll talk to someone like me or Brad. Now, increasingly, even you're getting those opportunities as well. Can you make a connection between the process of building scenarios for a story, for a science fiction story, and then developing similar kinds of scenarios for corporations or organizations that want to do future planning?
Yeah, this is something I do for the Engineer magazine in the UK. I write a monthly column called Sci-Fi Eye, where I look at something that's in the headlines and then just spin out crazy kind of extrapolation of what that could do.
Nice.
I've done stuff about medicine, about automated battlefields, about everything up to building Dyson spheres and so on. So it's what science fiction does. I think it doesn't predict the future, but it predicts a range of futures. And it, instead of telling you, a dry kind of prediction, it just tells you what it would be like to live in a future like that.
Yeah.
And so you can, from that, you can extrapolate other futures and kind of get a sense of what it is to, what the predictions mean on a human level. I think I remember seeing a cartoon years ago on Facebook of some scientists having cloned a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and it says, "Science will tell you what you can do, And then there's a picture of the Tyrannosaurus Rex chasing the scientist and says, but fiction will tell you why you should be careful. And it's that, there's that kind of thing, whereas it can, I said before, you can't predict the car without predicting the traffic jam. So science fiction, I think, is very good at predicting traffic jams, at taking a scenario and thinking, well, how can I mess this up? How can I make life difficult for my characters? Examining this. So, yeah, from that point of view, I think science fiction is a very good kind of modeling tool for future predictions.
Yeah. In a way, what you're describing, and with your column, Sci-Fi Eye, what you're telling us about is that you're kind of exercising this muscle for scenario planning. Right? It's like a workout routine, and if you do that routine often, then you're going to be quite fit when it comes to generating new scenarios, because we see that a lot here. We see a lot of sloppy, unathletic thinking about things like robot vehicles. Everybody I know would love to have a robot vehicle. Okay, but then they don't stop to think, like, what will happen when there's millions of these things on the road? How will they interoperate? How will they act? Who gets priority if there's a traffic jam? How will how will they deal with each other? The robot vehicles, how will they be aware of each other? What will change the traffic laws?
What happens to the truck drivers that
the insurance industry will change? Yeah, exactly. Right. So there's sort of this cascade of consequences. Some of them good, some of them positive, some of them mixed. Some unpredictable. And what I'm hearing you say is that it's useful to exercise that muscle to start to think through some of the consequences and not just the happy ideas. Let's zoom out.
So before we do that, I'll just make that one observation, Rob, that I think that's quite common amongst the people we talk to, either the sci-fi guys or the futurists, that they get used to thinking of those future paths or scenarios, and it does change your worldview, because if a new technology is announced or some breakthrough is announced, you're immediately thinking, what are the implications 10, 20, 30 years out? And it's a very different worldview than I guess most people have, which is worrying about putting food on the table next week, right? But sorry, go ahead, Rob.
No, that's okay. Let's zoom out a little bit. Let's talk about the far future. So taking today as our starting point, Gareth, tell us what your vision is for the next 20, 30 years out.
And what you're excited about.
What I'm excited about, I recently came across a new term in a review of a Kim Stanley Robinson book called Through-topia, which is not that we get a utopian society or we get dystopian society, but we just kind of muddle through. And I think that's our best shot at the moment. That climate change is going to be devastating. It's going to cause widespread trouble, but we can get through it. And I think at some point, some of us will muddle through. And I think that's been the human history since the dawn of time, is that we've muddled through. At one point, our entire species consisted of about 100 people living on a beach. And that was the entire human history. There's a bottleneck. But we bounced back, and we've done that a couple of times. And I think climate change is going to be another bottleneck. But we can hopefully get through. There are technologies we can use. There is, we are, as a species, we are curious and we are lucky. We are very bad at long-term planning. So I think if we can get through the next 50 years, I think we've got a pretty good shot at getting through the next 100. And if we get through the next 100, I think we will be in a place where we can have a much better control of our climate, a much better way of living in harmony with the planet. That's the challenge, I think. I would not like to put money on which way we're going to go, because
right now,
David Brin says we've got about a 40% chance. That was his estimate, which I thought was interesting.
He's thrilled about that. He was like, "It's excellent news. We've got a 40% chance. We have a chance." That's what he said to us.
Gareth, look, it's been phenomenal to have you on the show. Tell us a little bit more about Descendant Machine and when that's out.
That comes out from Titan Books in the UK and the US in April next year.
Awesome. And where can people? I know you're quite active on Twitter, because that's how we met, through Twitter, and follow you there. But where can people follow your musings and your thinking and stay in touch with what you're doing?
Well, my blog is on my website, which is GarethLPowell.com. I'm also very active, as you say, on Twitter and Instagram. And on both of those, I'm at Gareth L Powell. So simply enough.
Awesome. Now, just before we go, could you name your favorite sci-fi book or your favorite sci-fi author? We've talked about a lot of them in the past, just as a...
Oh, my word. That's like...
I know, choosing
naming your
best
favorite
baby.
grandparent.
Yeah, exactly.
Off the top of my head, probably Nova by Samuel R. Delaney.
Oh,
interesting.
You can see a lot. I think Ian Banks owes a big tip of the hat to that book as well. There's and a lot of he prefigured a lot of the cyberpunk imagery as well in there as well. It's the science in it is very questionable now in hindsight,
right?
But it's a rattling good retelling of the Grail lore and the the literary fireworks he employs. It's amazing. He wrote it when he was 20 years old.
Well, that's one I haven't read, so good recommendation. Wow. I'm going to have to get.
I would have guessed you'd say Ian Banks. I was surprised that you said Delaney.
Musk has been influenced strongly by Ian Banks too. You can tell, like just read the instructions. His ocean-going drones and so forth. But the Neuralink. It's
obviously not by Banks's politics, though.
No, true. What would you call?
What a pleasure it's been to have you on the show. Thank you so much, Gareth, for joining us. You've shared some really good philosophical musings about the role of the writer in creating scenarios. So we've enjoyed hearing from you. Thank you for joining the Futurists.
Thank you.
That's it for the Futurists this week. If you like what you heard, don't forget to check out our previous back catalog of episodes, and make sure you leave us a review on iTunes, wherever it is that you listen to your podcast, because that helps other people find us. Our thanks to the team that helped us with production this week, Elizabeth Severance and Kevin Hersham on the production side, Sylvie Johnson and Carlo Navarra on the social media side, and to all the team at the Futurists and Provoke for getting this show up. We will be back with more insights on the future next week, but until then, we'll see you in the future.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.